I wanted to thank Dusty for inviting me to be a part of this panel. And it's such an honor to be here with all of you and good to see old friends and make new ones. Now, Lynn, in terms of the question that you asked me, why clinical trials are so important, if you'd asked me this question 10 years earlier, I would have had a very, very different response. 10 years earlier, when we thought of clinical trials, we thought of clinical trials as sort of that last resort option for patients. And what I mean by a last resort option is an option that typically would happen when all types of treatments had been exhausted and there were no other treatment options to be offered to a particular patient. But that's completely changed. And now what we see at the foundation is as clinical trials as a part of standard of care. Clinical trials are a part of the normal treatment regimen for a lung cancer patient. And when I say a normal treatment regimen, what I mean by that is, again, flashback 10 years ago, if a patient was being offered clinical trials, the situation likely would have been that there were no other treatment options. But that's not the case anymore. Now, clinical trials are really the standard of care, and very often when a patient with lung cancer is first diagnosed, a clinical trial becomes an option. So it's the first treatment that a patient may actually have access to at the time of diagnosis. So it's not the last resort option anymore. So clinical trials are really, really the standard of care and getting patients access to much better therapeutics. Again, 10 years ago, drug development was looked at very differently, but now drugs are developed in a much more savvy fashion. The drugs are much more safer. There is very, very strong biology supporting the drugs that are being tested right now in clinical trials. So again, to sort of give a very, I apologize for a very long answer to that question, but again, to summarize, clinical trials are incredibly, incredibly important in the treatment regimen for a lung cancer patient and a part of standard of care.
Thank you, Dr. Basu Roy. Thank you. Dr. Ciupek, would you mind responding to the same question?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I couldn't agree with a lot of the sentiments that Upal said more. Lung cancer clinical trials for lung cancer patients and all cancer patients are really just such an important part of treatments at all points in your care journey. And, it's that getting access to some of the most cutting edge treatments and the things that will be the most, new and developing options can be done anytime. I mean, there's clinical trials being done for newly diagnosed patients, early stage patients, late patients, different treatment lines. And, I like to say that every treatment that a patient is receiving right now that's been approved that's working for patients was at one point in a phase 1 clinical trial and beyond. So really, the clinical trial is such an important part and should be thought of as a normal part of a treatment discussion, decisions you make, since those are the most cutting edge treatments that are being developed that you're accessing. And beyond that too, I think it's just clinical trials are so important for cancer patients too, because it helps us learn from you as a patient and help all other patients as well. The understandings that we gain from people participating in clinical trials lead to better understanding of lung cancer and new treatment options for everyone. So I like to say they benefit, not just yourself and getting access to the best treatments for you as a patient, but also the lung cancer community and pushing the envelope there at large. So really, it's never a wrong time to ask questions about clinical trials, I say.
Wonderful, thank you. Thank you. And Dr. Favaro, would you mind sharing your thoughts about why clinical trials are so important?
Yeah, no, thank you for having me today. It's just great to be here. Everything we're doing now in lung cancer treatment was started on a clinical trial. And that's the most important point, I think. I just got a visit today from a company called Guardant 360, and they are one of the companies that are doing liquid biopsies for lung cancer. And I mean, this would never been thought of 10 years ago, but take a sample of blood and you can determine from the circulating cancer cells, you can learn a lot about the lung cancer itself, what mutations are there, and it can actually, the results can come back within 7 days. And so, this is, cutting edge things are now we're actually able to use for patients that walk in with a newly diagnosed lung cancer in 7 days. You can actually know a lot about their cancer in terms of all the different mutations. And I think that the two areas of research that have really driven improved care for lung cancer, number one is looking at those mutations. There are a bunch of different driver mutations that actually drive the cancer cells to grow. And we've learned a lot about some of them, and we actually have drugs that target those mutations. None of that would have been possible without clinical research, not only just patient clinical research, but also in the laboratory, looking at mice and cell culture. I mean, discovering these specific mutations and then finding drugs to treat them has dramatically extended the life of stage 4 lung cancer patients. The other side of the coin is immunotherapy. You know, if you don't have a mutation, but we can turn your immune system on to fight the cancer, again, dramatic developments in the longevity of patients that have this disease. So, you know, we see patients a lot with newly diagnosed lung cancer. Sometimes they're eligible for clinical trials. Sometimes we put them on standard of care and they do great. And we can look at clinical trials later down the road if they progress. And so there's different ways to incorporate clinical trials, but I mean, how rapidly we've gone from the research to actually being able to apply this to patients has just been amazing. And it just gives us a lot of hope for new and better treatments down the road.
Wonderful, thank you, thank you. Okay, so gentlemen, our first question is a clinical trial something to consider as a patient's last hope? Would anyone like to respond to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, there's ways you can incorporate clinical trials, different ways, whether it's right at the beginning of their course or down the road. You know, there are a lot of, because these treatments have been so effective, sometimes the right treatment for somebody walking into your clinic is actually the standard of care. You know, let's give an example. Somebody who has a stage 4 lung cancer with an EGFR mutation. We really don't put those patients on clinical trials. We actually have a pill called Tagrisso, which is very effective, 18 to 24 months of disease control for those patients taking that medication. So we kind of use those very effective treatments up front. You know, and then, you know, down the road, you know, the good thing about these targeted therapies for those mutations are they work well at the beginning, but eventually you develop resistance. Okay, so when a cancer cell is developing resistance, then we've definitely got to look at other options. Whether there's something on the market or there's a clinical trial, we're really searching hard to get the right treatment for that person. Sometimes, and that's not always locally either. I mean, I live in Charlotte, North Carolina, but there's often not options in Charlotte. So we look at Duke or MD Anderson or go to Boston. So you can do national searches. And so it doesn't have to be the last choice. It could be in the middle, you know, when things are not working after the first line treatment. So there's a lot of different ways to put those in there. But I think it's definitely an important part of care, no matter what.
Thank you. Dr. Ciupek or Dr. Basu Roy?
I'll just echo what Dr. Favaro said, and the only thing that I would add is I sort of see the journey of a patient with lung cancer as a very mixed and heterogeneous journey, and where the clinical trial fits really depends on at what point the patient is at. And we know of patients, and Dusty, we know of Linnea Olson, who's been on 5 clinical trials, and she's gone from clinical trial A to B to C to D to E, which essentially means that it's really not the last resort, but it's the best resort at that point. And that best resort could be a standard of care. You know, when you're at a sort of, you know, I see the journey as having junctions. You might be at a different junction, and you might have a trial as an option, or you might have another treatment as an option. And that's when you have that candid discussion with your doctor. What is the best option? Is it the trial right now, or do I wait and just stay on standard of care and consider a trial when I'm at a different junction? So look at it as a journey, and you can have clinical trials as a part of the entire journey. You can switch on and off. You can go on a trial, then go on to standard of care, then go on to a trial. So again, it's all about hope, and it's all about the right choice for you at the time of your treatment journey.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Dr. Ciupek, would you like to chime in?
Yeah, no, I can just add to that, you know, briefly. Definitely, I agree with what the other two are saying. I think, you know, especially to Upal's point about how, you know, the cancer treatment journey is different for each patient. And the great point is that there are clinical trials that are being done at all points of treatment, from diagnosis to, you know, multiple lines of treatment. And, you know, I always say to patients, you know, having that conversation with your doctor as early as possible about where a clinical trial might fit into to my treatment options, and when the best time might be to do that, is a great way to start. Just having had that conversation will open that up, and then you can have that talk together about when the right time might be for you, because there are so many different options. And I just really encourage people to do that because of what everyone was saying.
Wonderful, thank you.
And another thing I'll quickly add to what Andrew and Justin brought up, and this just came to my mind in terms of the right time. I can share a very, very powerful story of a patient whose tumor had a RET mutation, and this RET mutation was discovered in 2015, and we did not have any RET blocking drugs at that time. So a doctor who is a researcher told her, we are going to put you on standard of care right now, but let's be patient because there is a drug in the horizon and that's going to be available through clinical trials. So right now we are using standard of care to buy you some time to get you on that clinical trial, which might be the best treatment option for you. So have these candid discussions with your doctor, because you may not know that there's a drug in the horizon that may be perfect for your lung cancer, but right now a standard of care treatment option is the right way, essentially to sort of do that bridging. And we call this bridging, to get you to that clinical trial when that trial becomes available. So all sorts of permutations and combinations are possible.
Great, that's wonderful, thank you. Thank you. And actually that kind of brings us to a question that one of our members has just asked. She's currently on Keytruda and was wondering if there are any clinical trials coming up that anyone knows of that beyond Keytruda, I guess. Okay. The next question we have is, some people think that if they enter a clinical trial that they will not receive the standard of care. Is this true, or?
Yeah, I can address maybe those questions.
Okay.
The first question with the Keytruda, with some increase in the size, the first thing I would do is do a Guardian 360 and just do a blood test looking for circulating tumor DNA. We know that sometimes the mutations inside the cancer change at the time of progression. So you want to look at that and see. It looks like that there was a HER2 mutation in her cancer originally, and if you still find it there, then I think you want to look for a clinical trial that can use a HER2 targeted treatment. They're going to target that mutation. So we always want to look and see what mutations are newly developing in the cancer, and then you can kind of use that information to decide where to go in terms of either standard of care or clinical trial, and depending on what's available locally, right, or how far you want to travel. All those things kind of come into the play in terms of what to do. But there's certainly plenty of options after using immunotherapy, whether it's a standard chemotherapy or clinical trial looking at those mutations. So plenty of options to look at there.
Thank you. Thank you. Would anyone else like to chime in on the question about standard of care?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a question we get a lot. A lot of people, especially newly diagnosed patients, have heard about clinical trials and they might sometimes involve a placebo. And understandably, for a lot of people, that they go, well, I don't want to receive a placebo. I want to receive a better treatment. And I think it's important to realize that a better way to kind of think about clinical trials is that you're always comparing to the standard of care. So if a clinical trial does have a placebo in it, the reason it does is because the standard of care, the normal thing that a doctor would do before, currently would be to kind of, just watch you over time and pay attention to you. And so you're never receiving less than the standard of care in a clinical trial. And in fact, a lot of clinical trials for cancer patients often aren't these kind of randomized clinical trials where you receive something, versus the standard of care, especially for, stage 4 patients, that phase 1 and 2 clinical trials. A lot of times everyone in the trial will receive the newer drug. And it's really only in phase 3 larger clinical trials that they're comparing to other things like the standard of care. But you will never receive less than the standard of care in a clinical trial. And in fact, a lot of clinical trials, everyone receives the newer treatment or the drug.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay. Our next question then is, what are the benefits for patients enrolling in a clinical trial? Would anyone like to respond to that?
I can start with that, and I'm
Mhm.
sure Dr. Ciupek and Dr. Favaro might have additional comments. I think from a patient advocacy perspective, when I think of clinical trials and when I'm thinking of our community, I think there are two, I would say actually three big advantages to thinking of a clinical trial as a part of your treatment option. Now, the first big advantage is you may have access to a new treatment option that would not be possible for you outside of a clinical trial. And in this case, when I'm thinking of a new treatment option, and I'm going to use RET as an example, which is a relatively new mutation, a new biomarker that was discovered, if a particular patient's tumor happens to have the RET alteration, then obviously accessing a drug that blocks the RET alteration through a clinical trial is a great option. Now, again, when Dr. Ciupek was mentioning that you can have randomized clinical trials, which are big and you can be on the standard of care arm, or you can be on the new drug arm. Even in that situation, if a patient is in a phase 3 clinical trial and happens to be on the standard of care arm, you may think that then what's the advantage? I say that there's a huge advantage even being on the standard of care arm because you have much more monitoring in a clinical trial. And when I say much more monitoring, you'll have many more scans, you'll have many more blood draws. The chances of catching your cancer if it starts growing is much higher because you have scans at much more frequency. The chances of your doctor detecting if you have brain metastases is much more frequent because you'll have brain MRIs. So even if a patient is on a standard of care arm, the monitoring is much better on a clinical trial. So that's the second big advantage of being on a clinical trial. And the third advantage of being on a clinical trial, and that's sort of a philosophical benefit I feel, is because it really helps expedite the drug development process. Because at the end of the day, we want really good drugs to be out in our patient community as quickly as possible. And by participating in a clinical trial, this process is accelerated.
Wonderful. It's great to know. Dr. Ciupek or Dr. Favaro, would you like to add anything to this question?
I think that's a good point about the getting the extra supervision, even if you're not on that arm that gets the experimental drug. And then some trials have crossover too. So at a certain point, you know, if the drug looks really good, they may cross you over from that standard of care to the new treatment as well. But all clinical trials that we would recommend should have standard of care as in both arms. And I think the advantage of it is you potentially could get the experimental treatment, which could help you live longer. I mean, that's really what you want is better, longer survival. And looking at that, I mean, you know, some of these medications that are now approved really have had dramatic improvements in outcomes. And so you want to be part of that if possible. It's exciting as a physician and a scientist to see these new technologies being used. We're involved in these tumor treating fields, clinical trial. Everybody gets standard of care, and then some of the patients will get the tumor treating fields. And you know, this is technology that has been proven to have improvements in survival for brain tumors and for mesothelioma. So now we're studying it in both squamous and adeno non-small cell lung cancer to see if there's benefit there. I mean, the biology of this treatment is interesting and has been shown beneficial. Let's try it in lung cancer. So that's the type of thing that's exciting for us and definitely gives an opportunity to have better outcomes. And
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you. And Dr. Ciupek, would you like to also add any other benefits?
I mean, no, just I very much agree with Justin and Upal. I mean, you know, we always say, you know, kind of the three things that Upal mentioned, you know, getting access to these new treatments is such an important part of clinical trials, obviously. But also, you know, this important point about the, you know, quality of care you get in the clinical trial and, you know, the frequency of care and being a part of it. That's why, you know, I really like what Upal said earlier about, you know, clinical trials being part of the standard of care for, you know, lung cancer patients, just because, you know, you receive such a high quality care there. And then, you know, just contributing to, you know, developing better options for all lung cancer patients. I mean, such an important part of, you know, being able to lay those building blocks for, you know, future options.
Thank you. Great. Well, now we're going to go to the opposite side of the spectrum. So what are some valid reasons for not participating in the clinical trial? Would you like to start, Dr. Ciupek?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one of the things that I do is, you mentioned is talk to patients who might have questions about clinical trials and are trying to figure out the best way, to have a conversation with their doctor about clinical trial options. And, you're always weighing multiple things. We talked about how earlier clinical trials throughout the treatment journey that you could take part in, but it may, the right time for you to take a clinical trial may differ from patient to patient. And, one of the most important things is having that conversation with your doctor. And, there may be, for instance, a great example Paul gave earlier in the panel is that there may be a clinical trial that's going to open in the future that may be a really good option for you. But now, the standard of care can kind of help bridge you to that clinical trial. And so there may be a really good reason, to do standard care now and then consider that clinical trial when it opens in the future. And that's just one example. So figuring out your own individual circumstances and having that discussion with your doctor about, when a clinical trial might fit in best is always a good thing. So that's potentially one reason, to choose something other than a clinical trial is if the standard of care makes sense for you at a particular time, or if there's a clinical trial option that might open in the future that might be better for you than clinical trial options that are currently available to you. And so that's just off the top of my head one reason. I don't know if Upal and Justin had more.
Anything else, Dr. Basu Roy or Dr. Favaro?
Just, in terms of, I think one of the things that comes up a lot is just whether or not there's an available clinical trial that you're eligible for locally, whether you want to stay here or you want to travel somewhere to find that. So that can be just, in general convenience or logistical, trying to spend time with family, quality of life.
That's a very good point you make. Dr. Roy, Dr. Basu Roy?
I'm actually just going to sort of piggyback on Dr. Favaro's point about the burden of participating in a clinical trial, especially when a trial is not available to a patient at a local center. And that's very different from the point that Andrew was bringing up, where standard of care might be the best option. So let's think of a situation where a clinical trial is a good option for a patient, but unfortunately a trial is not available within the local context of that patient. I think that's a very, very different discussion. And that's a very, very legitimate barrier that a lot of our patients face, that they're unable to travel to another city to access a particular clinical trial. And keeping in mind that it's not just a one-time travel, especially for a phase 1 clinical trial, you have to travel to another city a couple of different times a year. In fact, I don't see Melissa on the line. Melissa would actually be able to share firsthand her experience of participating in a trial which is not local, where she had to travel to a different city, and that is incredibly burdensome. And I think that is very often, sadly, a reason why a lot of our patients are unable to participate in a clinical trial. But the good news is that pharma companies, sponsors of clinical trials, they're realizing this problem. They're realizing that we need to make it easier for patients to participate in clinical trials. And there's a lot of discussion both at the FDA level, at the pharma level, and at the institutional level, where people are trying to figure out, are there ways to make this participation easy? For example, making travel less burdensome, making sure that the patient doesn't have to pay out-of-pocket costs to travel, taking care of travel and logistics. Are there ways where are there mechanisms by which some of the procedures of the trial can be conducted at the patient's local clinic, so the patient doesn't have to make 12 trips to the trial site, but instead makes 8 trips? So all of these different models to make trial participation easier for patients, that's definitely happening right now.
That's wonderful. And Dusty's just mentioned here that it's worth asking the sponsors to help cover some of those travel expenses and so forth. Yes.
Well, actually, Terry mentioned that, but let me also just say that Melissa, who couldn't be on the call, she's in a clinical trial that covers all of her travel expenses. And I guess it was Upal who mentioned it, from Florida to Memorial Sloan Kettering in New York. And I hope I'm not disclosing anything secret, but there's somebody else on the call who is in same clinical trial, but she goes from North Carolina to Boston, and all the cost is covered by the pharmaceutical company. It's wonderful.
Put on a plug for patient advocacy. What Dusty was talking about, pharma companies are becoming better at reimbursing clinical trial costs. This was not the case 10, 15 years ago, but thanks to all of you, thanks to patient advocates like all of you who brought this up, pharma companies are listening, and there is change happening right now, and change in a very, very positive fashion where patients are really sort of being front and center when they're thinking of trial designs. Again, the goal being, let's make the patient burden, the burden of participating in a clinical trial, as minimum as possible. So thank you again for all your advocacy. That's what's making the difference.
Wonderful, thank you. Yeah, and most definitely. And thank you for sharing, Elizabeth. Thank you for sharing your story. Before we move into our other questions, we do have some questions from the members. One of them is, how do the patients learn about the clinical trials? I know, Dr. Favaro, your office is conducting trials now, and we share that information with all of our members. But what about all the other trials? Where do patients learn about these trials other than from relying on their doctor?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I mean, every doctor has a website, or cancer program has a website, and the clinical trials should be on there. Sometimes they're not always updated, and sometimes they close, and you have to kind of talk to your physician about it. But clinicaltrials.gov is the website that kind of a national repository of clinical trials, and so you can search on there. And there's going to be a lot of lung cancer clinical trials when you do that search, but you potentially could narrow it down to your particular mutation, geographic area as well.
Wonderful, thank you. Thank you. And folks, I will make sure I include that link in our newsletter this month so that you have access to that. Another question was, there's so much excitement about clinical trials for non-small cell. What about small cell? Are there clinical trials also going on for small cell patients?
Yeah, absolutely. I think clinical trials are very important for small cell lung cancer patients. As you know, I'm sure so some people are aware. There haven't been as many approved treatments for small cell lung cancer compared to over the past few years compared to non-small cell lung cancer. But that is changing. I mean, we've seen the removal of immunotherapy into first-line treatment for small cell lung cancer patients. So we're starting to see improvements there. And I would say asking questions about clinical trials is critical for people who've been diagnosed with small cell lung cancer. There's a lot of different things going on right now. They're looking at, in addition to different ways and better ways to use immunotherapy for small cell lung cancer, they're also looking at therapies that take advantage of some of the natural biology of small cell lung cancers. A great example there are certain types of small cell lung cancer that have a protein called DLL3. And there are drug companies out there that are looking at targeted therapies against DLL3 that will be specific therapies for small cell lung cancer, since that's a property of some small cell lung cancers. And so there are these clinical trials out there, and I always really encourage small cell lung cancer patients who talk to us to ask about them and go out there. But there is a lot of hope. I mean, we're seeing new approvals for small cell. We're seeing a lot of clinical trials, a lot of interest in this, and definitely there are things out there.
Andrew, I want to just jump in on that. Did you say DLL?
3.
3. Now, how would a small cell patient know if they had that biomarker? Because by and large, they're not doing biomarker testing on small cells, correct?
Yeah, so right now, a lot of those, that testing is done as part of the clinical trials for these drugs. You're absolutely right in that right now, molecular biomarker testing isn't done as regularly for small cell lung cancer patients as non-small cell lung cancer patients. But that's why I think it's even more important to consider clinical trials as a small cell patient, because you'll be able to gain access to a lot of these. Just like we were saying, clinical trials always give you access to cutting edge things. The testing and new therapies that they're targeting are going to be in these clinical trials, and asking about that, and definitely asking your doctor what they think the best is for that.
I think there's a lot of, like Andrew said, a lot of hope for small cell. Traditionally, it's been chemotherapy, and then immunotherapy has been added in recently. But I've had patients that have had non-small cell lung cancer that transform into small cell lung cancer. And that is actually seen for some patients that had the EGFR mutation. And so even though they transformed into small cell, they still have that EGFR mutation. You can use that as part of your treatment to target that along with other chemotherapy, essentially. So I say for small cell, kind of know what your mutation profile is. That I would recommend having that sent on your cancer and also on your blood. And if you take the traditional therapy and then you progress, have it sent on your blood again. There's a lot of research going on looking at specific other types of drugs besides chemotherapy in small cell lung cancer. There's studies looking at CDK4/6 inhibitors, which attack the cell cycle. And those have been looked at and look promising. PARP inhibitors, which you may hear about that are used in BRCA1 or 2 mutated breast and ovarian cancer patients, actually may have effectiveness in small cell as well when combined with other treatments. So there's a lot out there to think about. A lot of this is clinical trials, but I think my message still is know your mutation profile, especially when you progress, get it checked again and see what options are out there for you.
Just quickly add to what Dr. Favaro brought up and Dusty's point about biomarker testing, that we don't do biomarker testing as standard of care for small cell lung cancer. I think, from a patient advocacy perspective and as a scientist, I see small cell lung cancer as being at a point of incredible hope right now. And one of the reasons why small cell lung cancer had sort of lagged behind in terms of clinical trials is because we did not have a very good understanding of the biology of the disease. But that really changed in 2012, 2013, when the government passed the Recalcitrant Cancer Act, which was specifically supporting specific types of cancers which had very, very very, very poor prognosis. And small cell lung cancer was one of those cancers that the government supported. And what that did was that triggered the sequencing of small cell tissue and us having a very, very good understanding of what this disease is about. And that's actually rapidly sort of led to a lot of clinical trials, both what Dr. Ciupek and Dr. Favaro were alluding to, some of the newer targets, for example, DLL3, PARP. All this was made possible because of that push from the Recalcitrant Cancer Act, which sort of led to a lot of research in small cell lung cancer. The other piece, I think, we often forget, and we have we have questions from the small cell patient community coming to us all the time that, non-small cell is so personalized. Small cell seems to be a one-size-fits-all approach. Why is that? That's actually changing right now. In fact, small cell is also becoming very biomarker segmented, albeit in the research setting, but that's going to become practice in the next couple of years. But we are also learning that small cell lung cancer is also very, very heterogeneous, very mixed, just like adenocarcinoma. So when you think of that pie, when you think of the EGFR and the ALKs, small cell is also starting to look like that pie where there are different mutations, different biomarkers, and each of these groups respond differently. So again, there is incredible hope, and I see hope in terms of both new treatment approaches, but more importantly, personalization of care for small cell lung cancer patients. So if you have this biomarker, you get this treatment. If you have this group of biomarkers, you get that treatment. And that's definitely happening.
Wonderful, thank you.
That's great.
Mm-hmm. Okay, guys, I have one more question for you, and then I'm going to turn it over because I know that there are some questions in the chat from people. What is the difference between a clinical trial and the right to try? That was one topic that we had a question about. Would anyone like to tackle that?
Yeah, I can start off, and then
Okay.
the others can add if they want to. So I think there's really two. They're both allow you to access treatments that may not normally be available to you because they aren't approved yet, but they're through very different means. With clinical trial, we've been talking about. These are the new drugs that are being tested in a formal research setting. They're going to go through the normal process of phase 1 through 3 to seek, FDA approval if they're working. And by, if you qualify for the clinical trial and you and your doctor think it's a good idea, you can enter the clinical trial and gain access to the drug that way. Right to try legislation that's been passed allows a different mechanism for people to access drugs. This is really for patients who, have tried all the standard options or options that may be available to them that a doctor would recommend, and also don't necessarily qualify for a clinical trial to be able to access a drug that way. In that particular case, the doctor and the patient can work directly with the pharmaceutical company to apply for this process to gain access to the drug that they wouldn't otherwise be able to get through a clinical trial. It's not the only way that you can access a drug. If you don't qualify for a clinical trial, the FDA also runs a program called Expanded Access, and this operates in a similar way to allow patients who wouldn't necessarily be able to access a drug through a clinical trial to access it, but involves directly going to the FDA and applying through that. So really, the bottom line is that there's multiple options for people to gain access to drugs depending on their situation. Having a discussion with your doctor about which ones might be the best for you to apply to. I think it's important for right to try is that from my understanding, most of them require a drug to have moved through the phase 1 portion of the clinical trial before you can access the drug through a right to try. So depending on where a drug is in development, what your personal circumstances are, expanded access, right to try, or a clinical trial may be an option for you. And they all fit in at different parts. And they're meant to be multiple tools to just allow as many patients to get access to treatments that may benefit them as possible.
Thank you. Good. Thank you for the clarification. Thank you.
And just to quickly add to what Andrew mentioned, and Andrew, thanks for bringing up expanded access, because that definitely is a mechanism for a single patient to get access to a drug. And think of an expanded access program as a clinical trial for just one patient. So what that essentially means is that you'll be going to your doctor and you'll be getting the same kind of monitoring very often that you would get in a clinical trial. So it's a one-patient clinical trial, put very simplistically. And right to try, as Andrew pointed out, is essentially for those patients who don't fulfill the criteria of participating in a clinical trial and very often may not also qualify for the expanded access program. But again, as a patient advocate, one of the things we do need to keep in mind, what's the difference between, say, the expanded access program or a clinical trial program and the right to try is when you are on the expanded access program or when you're on a clinical trial, the monitoring that goes on, and when I say the monitoring, all the scans that you need to get, and even management of side effects. Keep in mind that when you're in a clinical trial, these are new drugs, and so you may have side effects from these new drugs. So when you have side effects from these drugs, they are managed by your clinical trial team. But when you are in a right to try program, this formal monitoring does not exist. So when you have side effects, you will be treated not within a trial, but you'll be treated as just a general patient. And that may come with a significant amount of risk. So again, it's understanding how to access a particular drug, but also the risks of accessing a particular drug through a particular mechanism. So yes, the right to try may be an option, but keeping in mind that it also comes with a significant set of additional risks to you as a patient.
I think that's a great point, Upal, and just something that I wanted to add to that I was thinking about is, another thing is we talked earlier about how there's kind of these multiple benefits to clinical trials, one to yourself as a patient gaining access to these new therapies, but also contributing to the research and understanding of new therapies going forward. And another big difference is, these expanded access programs and clinical trials are set up to learn from the patients that receive the drugs. And, if you might have these side effects or, how a drug works for you, that, if you're in a clinical trial or formal program like expanded access, there's formal mechanisms to make note of what happens to you and learn from that for future patients. Whereas, if you receive the drug through right to try or, another mechanism where you're not part of that formal thing, we may not benefit from, lending the understanding of what happens to you as a patient in terms of side effects or, how effective the treatment is so that other patients and researchers can learn from that. And that's another, thing to consider too. There's multiple things to think about with different pathways.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay, guys, so we're going to go ahead and open up the floor. Let me move my view here so I can get everybody in here. So I know that we do have a question. I know, I believe Kevin and Elizabeth, you had a question. Let's see, are they still here? Yep, there you are. Yeah. Kevin, Elizabeth, did you or Kevin have a question that you wanted to ask? Go right ahead.
I think the question was targeted primarily towards these genetically driven cancers. Frequently they happen in younger population, and frequently they happen in people that haven't any risk factors identified, particularly like smoking. So are we making any progress on screening people who are quote unquote not at risk but still develop lung cancer?
I think that's a great point. Going through what you've been through over the last several years, it would be nice if you could have caught it, earlier. That's always important to do. I think that's kind of a good question for the primary care doctors too, because we have certain screening protocols that all patients go through for cancer. You get your colonoscopy, you get your mammogram. If you're a smoker and of a certain age, you get now the Medicare pays for yearly CAT scans, low dose radiation CAT scans of your lungs to screen for lung cancer. But if you're not in those categories, you're not a smoker, you're younger, there isn't any specific screening protocol that I'm aware of, for that. And it usually presents when you have symptoms from it. Would it be better if we got everybody a chest x-ray every year, regardless of your history? Would it be better if we got everybody a CAT scan every year with low dose radiation? Well, we have to realize that radiation yearly for the whole population could have some untoward side effects, and that's also potentially risk of cancer by exposing to extra radiation. So all those things kind of weigh into thought processes like that when deciding about screening programs. And so I'm not aware of any screening programs for exactly what you asked.
No, I think that's definitely, a thing that we're, is definitely we want to add to. Recently the U.S. Preventive Services Task Force, who makes decisions about, who to recommend different kinds of cancer screening to, did recommend that slightly more patients than before can be eligible. They lowered the age for eligibility for low-dose CT screening, allowed patients with a different kind of smoking history to get it, but there are incremental improvements, like Justin was saying, right now it's only these, smoking patients who are above the age of 50 who are recommended for screening. I think, one of the important things that can help drive that we think as an organization too, and others, is, understanding more about these people who get, who are at risk for cancer, some of these younger patients, who are perhaps never smokers and have different risk factors. And as we understand more from a research perspective about those risk factors, we can make better recommendations for who might, be screened for it. I know as an organization, with our sister organization, the Dario Lung Cancer Medical Institute, we're running a study called the Epidemiology of Young Lung Cancer Study. We take some of these patients who are, under the age of 40, who have, perhaps been never smokers, aren't in these traditional risk groups, and we have them fill out a questionnaire about different, family histories and different things that they've done in their life, and also provide a blood sample to look at some of their genetic and epigenetic characteristics and hopefully understand, more about what may have contributed to their cancer. And, I think through efforts like that, as we expand our understanding of, what truly makes people at risk for lung cancer, we can make better recommendations for more people. And I think, research like that is going to be important in this conversation as well.
Absolutely. And sorry, go ahead, Lynn.
I'm sorry, I just wanted to comment and ask you to talk a little bit more. I understand the radiological views and the concerns for that, but are they doing any blood testing, diagnostics that could be more easily performed?
Elizabeth, definitely. And one of the things that I think Dr. Favaro's point about using imaging or radiology is, I think, a perfect example of sort of, juggling that benefit versus risk of indiscriminately screening everyone, and thinking about, right now, as Andrew pointed out, the age of screening for lung cancer using imaging, using a CT scan is 50 and above, and that too with a history of smoking. Now, if we just brought that age down by, say, 10 years more, and we said, okay, 40 and above, that would increase. That means someone who's above the age of 40 would have, at least 30 to 40 years of radiation exposure to essentially essentially be screened throughout the process. And that's why, obviously, a radiological way of finding lung cancer, which is not risk-based, is probably not going to work. But having said that, there is a lot of research right now, and Andrew alluded to that as well, the study that Alchemy is doing, looking at risk factors of lung cancer in those patients who don't fit the screening criteria, who don't fit the smoking, the screening criteria. And we at LUNGevity Foundation, we have funded research at with different groups looking at the risk of developing lung cancer if someone in your family has lung cancer. So sort of the sort of the hereditary component of lung cancer, because we do know that there are various risk factors. Smoking is probably the most well-studied one at this point, but there are obviously other risk factors to lung cancer, for example, exposure to radon, to family history. So the big question is, how do we understand the risk in everyone who doesn't fit the smoking criteria? There is a huge proportion of patients who don't fit the screening criteria. And then next question is, how do we screen them really well? And your point about using a blood-based assay is very well made, because it's easy. It's easy to deploy. You can just go to your primary care provider's office and they do the test. And there is a lot of research happening in this space. Now, what we do see, what we think will happen, Elizabeth, is we may not end up with a lung cancer specific test in the next couple of years, but there are a lot of companies that are focusing on what's called a multi-cancer early detection test. And when I say a multi-cancer, using a blood test to check if you're at risk for lung, breast, colon, prostate. So a panel of cancers. And the goal is, if you come up positive in the multi-cancer early detection test, then you may have risk of developing lung, you may have risk of developing colon, you may have risk of developing breast. And once that test comes out positively, then we can think of doing a screening or an imaging kind of a modality. Then, you get flagged, for lack of better words, and then your doctor can proactively monitor you as you progress. So this discussion about using some kind of a blood-based monitoring system, Elizabeth, is already happening, and some clinical trials have already been run. Now, the technology is not ready for prime time, unfortunately, because this is extremely important, right? We cannot deploy a bad test into the population, because again, it's that risk-benefit discussion, because again, we can deploy a bad test, but if we get a lot of false positives, I think we end up scaring people also, because we don't want to do that. We want to have as accurate a test so we really identify people at risk. But all this is to say that, yes, discussions on using a blood-based approach is happening, and we do see some of that coming out to be available to our community within the next couple of years, for sure.
Thank you. I know, I'm sorry, go ahead, Dusty.
I just want to say thank you to that. You've made some very good points. And my husband and I have both I've been in medicine for 43 years, and he's right there behind me. And we never really had these discussions or radars on the screen to look for people. And I've checked off every box that could possibly be an alert to exposures of any kind. And I mean, every box, from the military farms, radon, everything in my history. And we've never done these questionnaires. So that's encouraging for a start. Thank you.
Thank you. I know Alyssa and Ed, or Buddy, is that correct? I think you both wanted to chime in on this along these lines. Is that true?
I was just curious about the sputum test. I started reading about it before the internet when I was diagnosed like 20 years ago. And every now and then it still comes up and people have gotten grants to look into it. And then I hear nothing about it again. So that's what I was wondering about. That would be great.
Okay.
My comment was to what Dr. Roy said about the fact that they lowered the screening age from 55 to 50. How long did it take to lower it to 50, and how long would it take, to get it down to 40, and maybe even remove the smoking history criteria?
In terms of how quickly the USPSTF responded to reducing it from 55 to 50, again, and I'll confess my ignorance on this, and I'm not, the USPS, from what I've learned and what I've heard, takes its own time to create guidelines and then change those guidelines. But from what I've heard from our doctor colleagues who have actually been involved with these guidelines, the US PSTF in this particular case with lung was actually quite quick in responding. Now, if you think of when the guidelines sort of came into the National Lung Screening Trial read out in 2011 and 2012, 2013 is when these guidelines, the original guidelines came into being. So now the guidelines changed in 2021. Now that's quite expeditious given the fact that only in 2020, which is last year, the draft guidelines came out when all of us were commenting on it. The US PSTF has turned it around pretty quickly. But your next question, which is decreasing it to 40 and then maybe taking the age restriction away or taking the smoking history restriction away, that's actually a much more complicated and nuanced question, because when we're thinking of cancer screening, we're thinking of it as a population level tool. What is screening? Can we deploy it to the entire population without causing harm? Now, if we were to remove all age restrictions and if we were to remove smoking restrictions, the likelihood of causing harm with that kind of a screening strategy using LDCT is actually much higher if we just decrease the age as a blanket number and if we remove the smoking restrictions, which is what goes back to what Dr. Favaro was bringing up earlier on, that given the current constraints of lung cancer screening, the guidelines make a lot of sense, which is smoking history and the age restriction. Now, will that change? Yes, probably, but it will probably not involve an imaging modality like LDCT screening. It will probably be a combination of imaging as well as blood-based screening.
I think that's why people are excited about these new technologies that you were talking about earlier too, Paul, with these blood-based kind of multi-cancer tests and other things that could allow us to maybe identify people that should be put into kind of, these, CT modalities or other advanced screenings. Because, you do get, if you do go for a CT scan, there's an exposure to radiation. I don't think a lot of people know, as the older you get, the more likely many of us will have lung nodules. Most of them will be benign, but, an LDCT scan will perhaps find a lung nodule of some sort on, many people, especially as they get older. And then, that may require, further investigation such as a biopsy to find out it's benign. And, there's a lot of things to consider, like what Upal was saying about potential, they call them harms, but they're things that, you may have to go through. And having something like a blood test for, to identify first whether you need to go through that, whether it's really important for you, can help us, best select these patients. And I totally agree that the technology and research like that will be really essential for getting people screened in the best possible way for them.
And Ed, I have a huge personal interest in this particular space of lung cancer screening because my aunt and my uncle, both of whom had lung cancer, neither of them would have fit the screening criteria. Neither of them would have fit the old screening criteria. Neither of them would fit the current screening criteria, 50 and above plus the smoking history. So that just tells us that we, as a scientific community, we need to be sort of rethinking lung cancer screening in general. Yes, right now we have risk-based screening, which is the US PSTF criteria, but there is a lot of research that's going on in the space that Andrew and Dr. Favaro were also alluding to, which is looking at the rest of the population, because in my mind, the ideal screening tool would be for the entire population. It would not be risk-based. Now, yes, smoking is a huge piece of that risk, but then there are other risk factors. And we are slowly moving in that direction. Are we there yet? Probably not. But will we get there? I remain very, very hopeful that we will get there sooner than I thought we would actually.
As an advocate, I am all about, I want everyone to be screened, but just think about if you guys could address the issue of the those who do meet the criteria for screening and they are not being screened. So that's a huge problem too. Yep. It's low-hanging fruit and
Absolutely, Dusty. That, in my opinion, is absolute travesty that people who qualify for current screening criteria, they themselves are not having access to screening. I think GoTo Foundation has done an amazing job through their centers of excellence, mobilizing different communities to make sure that people around those centers are aware of lung cancer screening and accessing screening. And we at the foundation we've also funded projects and continuing to fund projects to sort of solve this real issue of implementation, that when you have access to screening and when there are community members who qualify for screening, why are they not able to access screening? And that's a huge question. And that's a very, very important question, Dusty. And the problem being that the barriers to accessing screening tend to be somewhat local, that, you know, the issues in North Carolina and the issues in New York City might be very different. So we will need to have very local solutions. And I think, again, going back to the go-to centers of excellence model, mobilizing these centers of excellence, figuring out what these local barriers are and coming up with creative solutions to make sure that communities that are served by these centers have access to quality lung cancer screening. That's the way to go about it. And we are definitely thinking of this problem, Dusty. It's a huge issue. If we can't serve the people right now who are eligible for screening, how can we think of expanding, you know, lung cancer screening to the entire population?
Yeah, it was interesting. The national trends in cancer survival rates came out, and lung cancer survival rates have improved about 4.8%. That's recent data. That's one of the highest improvements of all different types of cancer. A lot of that has to do with decrease in smoking, but a lot of that has to do with the great advances in treatment. But obviously screening plays into that too. We know just in general, any cancer caught early is much more curable. We can cure early stage cancer. So I definitely agree with that. And that's something we've, as physicians and advocates, need to promote, screening.
Definitely, thank you. And I see if you look in chat, this is a strong conversation about primary care physicians. Definitely is a huge start too. So a little along, I think this is Carol, you had a question as well, I believe. Do you want to go ahead? Yeah, go right ahead.
Thanks, Lynn. And I appreciate it because it is kind of a touchy topic, and I'm glad I'm on here. My mother was diagnosed with lung cancer about 10 days ago, and we see the oncologist tomorrow. But you know, I work in healthcare in senior care, and I do a lot of speaking to things like the YMCA senior groups, church groups, Sun City, etc. And I will say I do a lot of advocacy with dementia and trying to get people encouraged to do trials and stuff like that. But when it comes to things like smoking, it's kind of like dementia. Nobody wants to get involved. And in smoking in particular, and lung cancers and certain cancers, there's very much a hate the person, not the disease, compared to most diseases, which are hate the disease, not the person, and provide the treatment. And I think that's important because it's really prevalent in healthcare and in people age maybe 50 to 75. And very much kind of a you get what you deserve type of approach. And I've seen that in healthcare professionals. I mean, appalling things come out of their mouths, as well as retirees and people who live in active living and stuff like that, and in church groups. So are you doing any kind of advocacy? Because honestly, if you can say the message, but if the ears aren't receptive, those people aren't going to be referring. And I will say, you know, with dementia trials, it's true that not all of them come from doctors. Referrals are coming from family members, from people, professionals outside of the primary care, or neurologists who are advocating for that. So it's important that those people are sharing that, because that's where most people get that information. And if there's a bias against it, they're not going to do it. And they're not going to advocate for the patient, and they're not going to have a conversation. I get told a lot of times, don't bring up dementia when you're talking to these groups and stuff, and don't bring up the diseases. But it's not because they're not prevalent. That is the core audience. It's that they don't want to get involved in a discussion. How can we combat that?
Dusty, do you want to jump in? And this is.
Well, I mean, actually, you know, there are many organizations who are reaching out to those people at risk. But, you know, I just wonder about going back to early detection for everyone and trying to reach out to them. You know, if we can't even get those who know they're at risk, at high risk, to take the test, and I don't even think they're aware of it, to tell you the truth. I don't think the primary care provider is making them aware. But I wonder how many people, like I did not meet the criteria for screening. Well, let me correct myself. There was no screening when I was diagnosed. But even today, even the more relaxed screening criteria, I would not have met, not by a long shot. So I just wonder how many people who are never smokers, who want screening for everyone, like if it was available, I mean, like how many of us would have even gone through this? I just don't know. I mean, because we don't have it, but I wish we did. But we are advocating. I know that, Dr. Ciupek and Dr. Roy and Dr. Favaro, as well as a lot of people here on this call are, passionate advocates who are trying their best to reach out to a population that has no idea that, what might be in their future as far as being at risk for lung cancer and the potential as far as going into a clinical trial and the support that's available to them and all kinds of things that are available. We're advocating for all of those things. And it is a very touchy situation, to Carol's point, because, some people are ashamed of their behavior. Some people are confused, and it's very it can be very challenging for us advocates, and we also get burned out, if you will, because we lose so many people, so many beautiful people, wonderful people, and it's heartbreaking, and we have to get up and reach out to the next person who's getting diagnosed, and but that's who we are and what we do, right?
I think I can understand your passion. I mean, you lose people and you realize, what could we have done to prevent this? What could we have done to catch it earlier? And understandably, I think that's what gets you going, though, right? Is to try to figure out a way that we can kind of prevent that down the road. I mean, recent studies showed that there was about 3,000 people looked at that had different types of cancer. And they did genetic testing in all these patients, and maybe about 10% or so, that might be too high of a number, but 5 or 10% of those patients that had different types of cancer had some sort of genetic pathogenic mutation that they were born with. It's also interesting too, is, what about things we're born with? How does that predispose us to lung cancer? There's not much on that. But I have to wonder about those that are non-smokers that get lung cancer early. Is there something that could have predicted this based on what they were born with in their genetics? And so I think we're going to see a lot of things come out, not only with screening people with blood tests, but also genetically, that I think could down the road help us to predict and prevent more than we're doing now. really enjoyed this as well. I'm going to put something in the chat box. I'm really excited about the new treatments and new hope in lung cancer. And I'll put in there a video about tumor treating fields and how those work in the treatment of lung cancer. Just keep in mind the new things that are coming out give a lot of hope. And I'm really excited about it. Thank you for having me.
Oh, thank you, Dr. Yes,
Thank you so
Dr.
much.
Favaro. And
Thank you.
And
Yes, thanks.
also, just so everyone else, I mean, like what we usually do, in case you're not familiar with the Charlotte group, we, after the speakers are dismissed, then we have a time of updating and networking, so.
Yeah, we can chat and stuff. I know that Chris has to take off in a little bit, but Dr. Favaro, if you don't mind, I would like to share the video in our newsletter that we send out, if that's okay.
Absolutely.
Thank you. And then we also, I think it was Dr. Roy, you mentioned that the GoTo Foundation has a clinical trial resource list. We'll make sure that that gets out as well.
I put it in the chat as well, Lynn.
Yes,
So we're gonna
thank
grab
you.
it from there. Thank you.
LUNGevity and GoTo, and also
Okay.
the LungCan also has works with a clinical trial navigation service. So it's no need for you to have to go to clinicaltrials.gov. You can go to one of these organizations and get somebody to help you because it can be overwhelming.
Gentlemen,
Take care, everyone.
thank you so much for sharing with
So
us.
great
We
to talk
truly
to you all
appreciate it.
today.
Thank
Thank you
you.
so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.